The morning of the auction, there were 8 Blue Basin nanny goats nobody wanted. They stood in a rusted holding pen at the far edge of the county livestock exchange, far away from the prime beef cattle and the heavy-wooled sheep that drew the serious money. The air in the auction barn was thick with the smell of sawdust, diesel exhaust, and the nervous sweat of hundreds of animals waiting for the gavel to dictate their futures. The morning sun cut through the gaps in the corrugated tin roof, illuminating thick, swirling columns of dust that danced above the crowded pens. Men in heavy denim and canvas work coats leaned against the pipe rails, holding steaming cups of black coffee in calloused hands, their eyes scanning the lots with the cold, calculating geometry of modern agriculture. They were looking for yield. They were looking for fast growth, heavy weaning weights, and animals that fit neatly into the spreadsheets that governed their massive, debt-leveraged operations. Nobody was looking at the 8 scrawny nannies huddled in the corner of pen number 42. They were a forgotten breed, a relic of a time before dairy operations became factories of stainless steel and concrete. Their coats were a dusty, mottled roan, thick and tangled with burrs from whatever marginal pasture they had been scraped off of. Their eyes were dull, their hip bones protruded sharply against their flanks, and their curved, sweeping horns looked too heavy for their narrow skulls. They were the remnants of a closed-out estate, the last of a line that had simply outlived its economic usefulness in a world that demanded uniformity and volume. They were, by all conventional metrics, entirely worthless. Clara walked past the pens holding the valuable stock. She was a young woman, 30 years old, though the quiet exhaustion in her eyes made her look older. She wore a faded canvas jacket that had belonged to her grandfather, the sleeves rolled up to expose her wrists, and a pair of worn leather boots that moved silently over the concrete floor. She had returned to the county only 3 weeks prior, leaving behind a nameless, sprawling city where she had spent the last 8 years quietly failing. It had not been a spectacular failure, not a sudden explosion of ruin, but rather the slow, quiet fraying of a rope under constant, unseen tension. She had worked in a cubicle bathed in fluorescent light, manipulating numbers on a screen for a logistics company, feeling her spirit thin out day by day until she felt entirely translucent. When the letter arrived from the county courthouse informing her that her grandfather had passed and left her the deed to the old family farm, she had packed her life into a single car and driven away from the concrete without looking back. Now, she stood in the auction barn, an outsider in the place she had once called home, possessing no clear plan, possessing only a small, finite inheritance and a desperate need to anchor herself to something real. She bypassed the loud, fast-talking auctioneer and the crowded bleachers, walking deliberately toward the back pens where the air was cooler and the shadows were longer. She stopped in front of pen 42 and rested her hands on the cold steel pipe. She watched the 8 nannies for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable to the casual observer. She watched the way they stood, not in panic, but in a quiet, enduring huddle. She watched the way their ears pivoted independently, taking in the chaos of the barn without surrendering to it. She saw the deep, ancestral resilience in the set of their jaws, a stubbornness that resonated with something small and hard that had recently crystallized inside her own chest. When the auctioneer finally reached pen 42, his voice lost its frantic, rhythmic urgency and settled into a dismissive, flat drone. He announced the lot as a miscellaneous group of brush goats, suggesting half-heartedly that they might be good for clearing out a briar patch before being sent to the butcher. The starting bid he asked for was insultingly low, a mere formality to clear the pen. Silence hung in the dusty air. A few men chuckled, shaking their heads and turning away to check their auction catalogs for the next lot of commercial steers. Clara raised her numbered card. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, and called out her bid. He asked for a counteroffer, scanning the crowd, but the silence remained unbroken. The gavel fell with a sharp, hollow crack against the wooden block. Clara had bought the entire lot for a price that barely covered the cost of the auction house fees. As she walked toward the clerk's window to settle her account, the low murmur of the crowd swelled into distinct voices. She felt the weight of their eyes on her back, the collective judgment of men who measured worth in tons and dollars. Harlan Vance stood near the exit, blocking the light from the open doorway. Harlan was a named, established, and deeply respected figure in the local agricultural community. He farmed 3,000 acres of prime bottomland, ran a herd of 400 registered Angus cattle, and drove a truck that cost more than the farmhouse Clara had just inherited. He was a man of force, a man who believed that nature was an adversary to be conquered with heavy machinery, chemical fertilizers, and massive influxes of borrowed capital. He wore a crisp, clean cattleman's hat and a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate, one at a regional livestock show a decade ago. As Clara approached, Harlan shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked at the receipt in her hand and then out toward the loading docks where the 8 nannies were being herded onto Clara's rusted trailer. He let out a loud, booming laugh that carried over the noise of the barn. He looked around to ensure he had an audience, his lieutenants and neighbors grinning in anticipation. He pointed a thick finger toward the trailer. He stated loudly, for the benefit of everyone listening, that she had just bought herself 8 head of coyote bait. He predicted, with the absolute certainty of a man who has never been forced to question his own methods, that those animals would be dead before the first frost, that she had wasted what little money she had, and that she would be crawling back to the city before the year was out. He declared it a foolish, sentimental waste of time, 1,000 funerals waiting to happen. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Before we go further into what happened out there on that neglected piece of land, I want to ask you to tap the like button if you enjoy this type of story. And please, leave a comment telling me the name of the town or city you are watching from, because I read every single one and I like knowing where these stories travel. Now, back to Clara and those 8 unwanted goats. The drive back to the inherited farm was slow, the rusted suspension of Clara's truck groaning under the shifting weight of the trailer. The farm sat at the end of a long, deeply rutted dirt road that wound through a dense stand of old-growth oak and hickory trees. It was a property that the rest of the county had long ago written off as unproductive, a marginal piece of land that rolled in steep, rocky hills and deep, shadowed hollows. When Clara finally pulled the truck into the dirt driveway and killed the engine, the silence of the place rushed in to fill the cab. She stepped out and looked at her inheritance. It was a multi-generational family farm that had suffered from decades of quiet neglect. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure of peeling white paint, its front porch sagging heavily on one side like a tired shoulder. The main barn leaned precariously against the prevailing wind, its silvered siding missing in several places, exposing the dark, cavernous interior. The pastures, which had once been cleared and grazed by her grandfather's flock, were now aggressively overgrown with dense thickets of blackberry brambles, thorny locust saplings, and tall, coarse weeds that choked out the native grasses. To the modern agricultural eye, it was a disaster, a piece of land that would require thousands of dollars in chemical herbicides and heavy bulldozing to make it profitable. But as Clara walked the fence line that first afternoon, letting the 8 nannies out into a small, relatively secure paddock near the barn, she did not feel the crushing weight of a burden. Instead of scattering into a panic about the magnitude of the work, something deep and fundamental inside her had finally settled. She decided in that moment, watching the setting sun paint the leaning barn in shades of gold and rust, that she would not sell the land. She would not bulldoze the hills. She would stay and she would learn to understand the place. Her first weeks on the farm were spent in a state of quiet, deliberate observation. She did not rush to buy tractors or clear land. She walked the property every morning at dawn, learning the way the dew gathered in the low hollows, mapping the hidden springs that trickled over the limestone outcroppings, and studying the specific varieties of brush that thrived in the rocky soil. She watched the 8 Blue Basin nannies with an intensity that bordered on meditation. They were skittish at first, staying clumped together in the farthest corner of the paddock, but slowly, they began to explore. Clara noticed that they did not graze like sheep or cattle, keeping their heads down to crop the short grass. Instead, they browsed. They stood on their hind legs to reach the tender leaves of the locust saplings. They stripped the bark from the overgrown woody shrubs, and they devoured the thorny blackberry brambles with an incredible, methodical efficiency. They were uniquely adapted to the exact type of rough, marginal forage that had taken over the farm. Clara realized that they were not a liability. They were an incredibly specialized tool, a biological mechanism designed to process the exact landscape she had inherited. It was during a rainy afternoon in her second week, while searching for a dry tarp in the attic of the farmhouse, that Clara made the discovery that would shape the rest of her life. The attic was a dusty, forgotten space, smelling of dry wood, old wool, and the trapped heat of countless summers. Tucked beneath a dormer window, covered by a moth-eaten quilt, was a heavy, iron-bound trunk. Clara opened it and found it filled with her grandfather's things. Among the old photographs and rusted pocket knives was a collection of thick, leather-bound ledger books. Clara carried the heavy stack downstairs to the kitchen table, wiped the dust from the covers, and opened the first volume. The pages were filled with her grandfather's meticulous, looping handwriting. These were not simple farm logs recording the purchase of feed or the sale of stock. They were decades of detailed, patient observations about the land, the weather, and the animals. They read like the field notes of a man studying something he loved with a profound and quiet reverence. He recorded the exact date the first redbud trees bloomed, the changing migratory patterns of the barn swallows, the specific weeds that indicated a deficiency in the soil, and the behavior of his animals in relation to the phases of the moon. As Clara read through the night, the rain beating a steady rhythm against the tin roof, she discovered a recurring, underlined phrase that her grandfather had written across multiple volumes. It was a central thesis, a guiding philosophy that anchored his entire approach to the land. He wrote over and over, "The ground remembers." He wrote about the folly of forcing the land to be something it was not, about the arrogance of deep plowing and the danger of heavy debt. He wrote, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and the future does not like being told." He detailed a method of farming that relied on patience, observation, and working in concert with the natural tendencies of the landscape, rather than fighting a constant, expensive war against them. He detailed how to use animals to heal the soil, how to move them in tight, controlled rotations to mimic the migratory patterns of wild herds, allowing the land long periods of rest to recover and build deep root systems. Clara realized that the knowledge she needed to survive was not found in the glossy agricultural magazines that Harlan Vance read, but right here, in the fading ink of a man who had understood the slow, enduring pulse of the earth. To fully unlock the practical application of this ancestral knowledge, Clara knew she needed a translator, someone who remembered the old ways not just in theory, but in the muscle memory of their hands. The next morning, she drove across the county to visit her great-aunt Martha. Martha was her grandfather's sister, a woman in her late 80s who lived alone in a small, immaculately kept house at the edge of a pine forest. She was a woman who had outlived her husband, her siblings, and most of her friends, sustained by a fierce independence and a diet of garden vegetables and stubbornness. She wore practical men's flannel shirts, thick denim trousers, and kept her silver hair pulled back in a severe, uncompromising bun. She was terse, economical with her words, and deeply observant. When Clara sat at her small kitchen table, sipping a cup of strong, bitter tea, she explained her purchase of the Blue Basin nannies and her discovery of the ledgers. Martha listened in silence, her faded blue eyes studying Clara's face with a penetrating intensity. When Clara finished, Martha set her teacup down with a soft clink. She leaned forward and asked a single, defining question. She asked if Clara had noticed how the goats behaved in the auction pen, whether they had run against the rails in a panic or if they had stood their ground in the center. Clara remembered the quiet, enduring huddle of the 8 nannies, and she nodded, confirming they had stood in the middle. Martha gave a short, single nod of approval. She told Clara that the ones in the middle were the ones who knew how to wait, the ones who conserved their strength, the ones who had the deep, enduring blood. She confirmed the value of the ledgers, telling Clara that her grandfather had known more about the breath of the soil than any man in the state, but the county had laughed at him because his methods were slow, and men are always in a hurry to be rich. Martha's final piece of advice was simple and absolute. She told Clara to keep her fences tight, to move the animals every single day, and to never let a man with a tractor tell her how to grow grass. Armed with the ledgers and the quiet blessing of her elder, Clara began the slow, unglamorous, and invisible work of bringing the farm back to life. She did not buy expensive machinery or chemical fertilizers. She spent her dwindling funds on rolls of high-tensile wire, step-in fiberglass posts, and a solar-powered fence charger. She began the exhausting daily routine of rotational grazing. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, she walked out into the dew-soaked pastures and set up a new, small paddock, moving the temporary fencing by hand. She would then open the gate and let the 8 nannies into the fresh section of brush and weeds. The goats attacked the overgrown vegetation with a joyful ferocity, trampling the tough stalks, stripping the leaves, and leaving behind their rich, pelletized manure. After a single day, Clara would move them again, leaving the grazed section to rest and recover for weeks, sometimes months, before the animals returned. It was a method that required no gasoline, no heavy equipment, and no debt. It required only time, physical labor, and an intimate, daily attention to the condition of the land and the animals. It was work that was entirely invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention. To the casual observer driving past the end of her dirt road, the farm still looked like a wild, untamed mess of brush and weeds. The local community, however, was not paying close attention to the soil. They were paying attention to the gossip. The county's true circulatory system was Elias Pratt's feed store, a large, dusty building smelling of sweet molasses, cracked corn, and leather halters. It was where the established farmers gathered every morning to drink bad coffee, complain about the weather, and measure their own success against the perceived failures of their neighbors. Harlan Vance held court there, leaning his heavy frame against the wooden counter, his voice dominating the room. Whenever Clara came into the store to buy a bag of loose mineral or a replacement insulator for her fence, the conversation would subtly shift. Harlan and his lieutenants would offer a chorus of false friendliness, their smiles carrying the sharp edge of condescension. They would ask her, with exaggerated concern, how her little flock of brush eaters was doing, or if she had managed to find any actual grass under all those briars. They inquired if she needed a real man to come out with a brush hog and clean up her mess. Clara never took the bait. She did not get angry, she did not defend her methods, and she did not try to explain the complex biological mechanics of rotational grazing to men who only understood brute force. She possessed a quiet confidence, a certainty rooted in the pages of her grandfather's ledgers and the daily, observable changes on her land. When Harlan asked his mocking questions, Clara would look at him with a level, unblinking gaze and offer a terse, economical reply. She would simply say that the goats were eating the brush, or she would nod and say, "That is one approach," referring to his offer of machinery. Her flat, non-reactive tone took the fun out of the teasing. It left the mockers in an awkward, hollow silence, their jokes dying in the dusty air of the feed store. They wanted a reaction. They wanted her to feel foolish, but her calm, steadfast demeanor made them feel, strangely, as though they were the ones missing the joke. Elias Pratt, the old-timer who owned the feed store, observed these exchanges from behind the cash register with silent, sharp eyes. He was a man who had seen generations of farmers rise and fall on the tides of debt and weather. He rarely spoke, but he noticed everything. One morning, after Harlan had delivered a particularly loud lecture on the necessity of chemical weed control and strode out of the store, Clara brought her small purchase to the counter. Elias bagged her items slowly. He looked up at her, his weathered face breaking into a very small, private smile. He leaned forward over the worn wood of the counter and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He told her that he remembered her grandfather, that he used to come into the store 50 years ago and buy the exact same type of wire. He told her that the men in the store used to laugh at him, too, right up until the year the bottom dropped out of the cattle market and her grandfather was the only man in the county who did not owe the bank his soul. Elias nodded toward the door where Harlan had exited, and told Clara to just keep walking her fence lines. It was a small, quiet confirmation, the first piece of external validation Clara had received from the community, and she carried it with her like a smooth stone in her pocket. As the first year turned into the second, the invisible work began to produce visible results. The 8 nannies, thriving on the diverse, mineral-rich diet of the deep-rooted brush, grew strong and heavy. Their matted coats shed out to reveal a healthy, shining roan, and their dull eyes brightened with a clear, intelligent vitality. In the spring, they delivered healthy, vigorous kids, doubling the size of the flock without a single complication. Clara recorded the births in a new ledger, writing the numbers down without ceremony, but allowing herself a long moment to sit on an overturned bucket in the leaning barn and simply breathe in the smell of the clean hay and the new life. The land, too, was responding to the ancient rhythm of the rotational grazing. The aggressive blackberry brambles and thorny locusts were being pushed back, their energy exhausted by the constant, timed browsing. In their place, native prairie grasses, long dormant in the seed bank of the soil, began to push through the earth. Big bluestem, Indian grass, and switchgrass returned, their deep roots breaking up the hardpan and allowing rainwater to infiltrate deeply into the ground, rather than running off the surface. Dung beetles returned to process the manure, cycling nutrients back into the earth with incredible speed. The soil, once hard and lifeless, became dark, crumbly, and fragrant with microscopic life. The first tangible success of her enterprise came almost by accident. The Blue Basin nannies, feeding on the rich, diverse forage, began to produce milk that was fundamentally different from anything found in a commercial dairy. It was incredibly rich, high in butterfat, and carried a complex, herbal flavor profile that tasted quite literally of the land itself, capturing the essence of the wild mint, the chicory, and the deep-rooted grasses they consumed. Clara began milking a few of the nannies by hand, primarily for her own use. She found an old, heavy cast-iron cheese press in the cellar and, following a recipe she found tucked into the back of one of the ledgers, she began experimenting with small batches of hard cheese. She aged the wheels in the cool, constant temperature of the stone cellar, turning them and rubbing them with olive oil. When she finally cut into the first wheel months later, the texture was perfect, crystalline and firm, and the flavor was a revelation, sharp, nutty, and entirely unique. She wrapped a small wedge in brown paper and took it to Elias Pratt at the feed store. Elias tasted it silently, his eyes widening marginally. The next week, the owner of a small, artisanal bakery in the neighboring town, a man who sourced local ingredients, stopped by Clara's farm on Elias's recommendation. He tasted the cheese, walked the pastures, and looked at the healthy, vibrant goats. He asked for a name to put on the small chalkboard menu in his shop. Clara looked out toward the ridge where a lightning strike had once blackened a large oak tree, a place the goats loved to sleep. She told him, without intentional branding or marketing strategy, to call it Burnt Fork. The baker bought every piece of cheese she had ready. Word of mouth spread with the slow, steady persistence of water finding its level. Within 6 months, a high-end regional creamery, desperately searching for unique, high-quality milk sources to differentiate their products, contacted Clara. They drove out, tested the milk, and offered her a premium contract for every drop she could produce. They were astonished by the butterfat content and the cleanliness of her operation. The small, stubborn enterprise had found its footing, not through loud advertising or massive scale, but through the undeniable, quiet proof of absolute quality. When the sudden demand for her product arose, Clara faced the temptation that had ruined countless farmers before her. The urge to scale up rapidly, to borrow heavily against her initial success, to build massive modern barns and buy hundreds of conventional goats to meet the creamery's capacity. She sat at her kitchen table, the contract in her hand, and opened her grandfather's ledger. She read the underlined words again. Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do. She declined the massive expansion. She chose to grow the way the land could grow, slowly, keeping back her best female kids to expand the flock naturally, ensuring that the genetics of the Blue Basin nannies remained pure and adapted to her specific landscape. She let the demand pull the operation forward, rather than letting debt push it into a state of precarious imbalance. Then came the great crisis. It arrived in the 3rd summer, creeping in slowly at first, a subtle shift in the weather patterns that soon hardened into a brutal, unrelenting reality. It was the worst drought in living memory. The spring rains simply failed to materialize, and by early June, the sky was a pale, bleached blue, empty of clouds. The sun beat down with a fierce, punishing intensity, baking the earth until it cracked into deep, jagged fissures. The hot winds blew constantly, pulling every ounce of moisture from the topsoil. Across the county, the conventional, over-leveraged farms were devastated. Their shallow-rooted, chemically dependent pasture grasses withered and turned the color of old straw by July. The massive herds of heavy, commercial cattle, bred for fast growth on lush feed, began to lose weight rapidly as the pastures turned to dust. The creeks dried up, leaving only cracked mud in the streambeds. The farmers who had mocked Clara found themselves caught in a terrifying vice. They had to buy expensive hay trucked in from states away just to keep their animals alive, burning through their credit lines at an alarming rate. When the credit ran out, they were forced into the brutal reality of liquidating their herds. The local livestock auction yard, the same place where Clara had bought her 8 unwanted nannies, was flooded with thousands of starving, desperate animals being sold at a massive loss into a completely collapsed market. Harlan Vance, the loudest voice in the county, was hit the hardest. His 3,000 acres of prime bottomland, stripped of its natural resilience by decades of deep plowing and chemical application, blew away in thick clouds of dust. His massive, expensive tractors sat idle, useless against the sky. He was forced to sell 2/3 of his prized Angus herd for pennies on the dollar, watching his immense, debt-fueled empire shrink violently under the relentless sun. Through the burning months of the drought, Clara's farm remained a miracle of biology. It was a green island in a brown county. The deep-rooted native grasses she had encouraged through rotational grazing reached far below the cracked surface, pulling up moisture from deep within the subsoil. The diverse array of woody brush and drought-resistant weeds, which the conventional farmers despised, remained green and nutritious. The canopy of the old-growth trees provided deep, cooling shade. Her soil, rich with organic matter and protected by a thick layer of trampled plant litter, held onto every drop of morning dew like a sponge. The Blue Basin nannies, descendants of animals that had survived in harsh, arid landscapes for centuries, did not just survive the drought. They thrived. They continued to browse the tough vegetation, their milk production barely dipping. Clara continued her daily routine, moving the fences, observing the land, and carefully managing the impact of the animals to protect the fragile pasture. People began to drive out just to look. They would park their dusty trucks at the end of Clara's dirt road and stand at the fence line, staring at the impossible sight of green grass and healthy, fat animals in the middle of a catastrophic dry spell. They looked at the deep, dark soil where the goats had recently grazed, contrasting it with the blowing dust of their own fields. The visual proof was absolute and undeniable. The skeptics finally and completely understood what they were looking at. They were not looking at a lucky accident. They were looking at a masterclass in ecological resilience. They were seeing the physical manifestation of patience, observation, and the ancestral wisdom that they had so arrogantly dismissed. The turning point in the community's perception culminated in a quiet, profoundly significant event. One evening, as the heat of the day was finally breaking, Clara was in the barn checking a newly repaired hinge on a gate. She heard the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway. She walked out into the fading light and saw Harlan Vance's expensive truck parked near the house. Harlan stepped out slowly. He looked older, the confident swagger completely erased from his posture. The loud, booming voice was gone. He walked toward Clara holding his cattleman's hat in his hands, his head bowed slightly. He stopped a few paces away and looked out over the green pasture where the flock of roan goats was peacefully grazing. He stood in silence for a long time, the weight of his recent losses hanging heavy in the air between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, and stripped of all pretense. He did not offer a formal, groveling apology. He simply stated a fact. He said plainly and directly that he was wrong. He said it not as praise, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things, an admission that the world did not work the way he had always believed it did. He looked at Clara, his eyes scanning the solid, unpretentious reality of her farm. He asked, with a quiet desperation, if she would teach him. He offered to lease her his remaining bottomland, to partner with her, to buy her superior breeding stock at whatever price she named. He asked to learn how to make the ground remember. Clara looked at the broken man standing before her. She felt no desire to gloat, no need for triumphant vindication. Her victory was quiet, proven by the soil and the animals, and it did not require the humiliation of another to make it real. She answered him with the same level, plain-spoken tone she had used in the feed store years ago. She told him that she would not partner, and she would not take on his debt. But she told him that she would walk his fields with him, that she would show him how to read the weeds, and how to begin the slow work of healing the dirt. She accepted his surrender with grace, understanding that his conversion would do what her own success alone could not. Harlan Vance was a leader in the community, and his quiet, humbled submission to her methods signaled a massive shift in the county's agricultural mindset. Other established farmers, men who had previously mocked her, began to visit the farm. They came asking questions about wire gauges, grazing intervals, and the specific biology of dung beetles. Clara became a teacher, sharing her grandfather's knowledge freely, walking the men through her fields, digging her hands into the dark earth to show them the living structure of the soil. The transmission of the ancestral legacy was not limited to the older generation. A few months after the drought broke, a local teenager named David began riding his bicycle out to the farm after school. David was a serious, quiet boy, the son of a mechanic who had no land of his own. He possessed a natural, unhurried rhythm and a deep, observant stillness. He stood by the fence watching Clara move the goats, asking soft, intelligent questions about the angles of the sun and the resting periods of the grass. Clara recognized in him the same quiet patience that her grandfather had written about in the ledgers. She hired him. She paid him a fair wage and began to teach him the invisible work. She taught him how to set a fence post so it would not heave in the winter, how to read the health of a goat by the shine of its coat and the shape of its hoof, and how to understand the complex, conversational relationship between the animal and the earth. David absorbed the knowledge deeply. He had the hands for the work, moving among the animals without causing alarm, his actions deliberate and calm. In David, Clara saw the future of the legacy secured, the transfer of the old wisdom to a new mind that would carry it forward into the decades to come. In the late autumn of the 4th year, Great-Aunt Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had lived just long enough to see Clara's full success, to see the leaning barn stabilized, the pastures restored, and the county's respect earned. During Clara's last visit to the small house by the pine forest, Martha had sat in her rocking chair, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at Clara with a profound, quiet pride. She had told Clara that her grandfather would have liked the cheese, and that the fences looked tight. It was the highest praise the old woman could offer, and it settled deep into Clara's bones. Martha's death marked a profound transition. The mantle of the wise elder, the keeper of the county's deep memory, had quietly shifted to Clara. She was no longer the young outsider struggling to understand a neglected inheritance. She was the respected pillar of the community, the woman who knew how to listen to the land. The story came full circle on a cold, crisp morning in November. Clara drove her truck, pulling a new, sturdy livestock trailer, back to the county exchange. She was not there to buy. She was there to sell a small group of young, registered Blue Basin breeding bucks, the surplus of her thriving flock. The air in the auction barn still smelled of sawdust and diesel. The dust motes still danced in the shafts of light, and the men in heavy coats still leaned against the pipe rails. But as Clara unloaded the magnificent, heavy-horned animals into the prime holding pens near the front of the barn, the atmosphere was entirely different. The auctioneer stepped down from his block to look at the animals, admiring their deep chests and bright eyes. The men in the crowd gathered around the pen, not to mock, but to study. They recognized the supreme quality, the deep, resilient genetics that had survived the worst drought in a century. When the gavel finally fell, the bidding was fierce, driving the price up to a premium level that reflected the true, undeniable worth of the animals. This time, no one laughed. Harlan Vance stood near the front of the crowd, nodding silently as the hammer fell, a student acknowledging the mastery of his teacher. Clara stood by the clerk's window watching the exchange. She felt a bittersweet ache in her chest, a profound mix of success and the quiet grief that the man who had written the ledgers, the man who would have been proudest of this moment, was not there to see it. But she knew that he was present in the dark soil of her pastures, in the tight wire of her fences, and in the healthy, enduring blood of the animals she had saved. The narrative of Clara and the 8 forgotten nannies leaves us with a few enduring truths, etched into the landscape of that once neglected farm. It proves that the rejected thing is often the most valuable thing, provided you possess the patience and the wisdom to know how to read it. It demonstrates that the slow, deliberate work of observation will always outlast the frantic, expensive application of force. It shows that true worth does not need to shout, argue, or defend itself in the dusty aisles of a feed store, because in the end, given enough time and the right kind of attention, it simply and undeniably proves itself. That is the story of the Blue Basin nannies, the grandfather's ledger, and the woman who learned to make the ground remember. Before you go, I want to ask you to share this story with someone who has been told that their ideas, or their methods, or their passions are not worth much. And down in the comments, please tell me about the thing in your own life that everybody laughed at. Tell me about the small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway, despite the noise and the skepticism. I read every comment. Every one. I will read yours.